The Willow Creek Estates neighborhood had been marketed as a pristine community, a safe haven of manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and smiling faces at every cul-de-sac barbecue. But beneath the glossy surface, tensions simmered, ruled by an iron-fisted HOA president named Marjorie Kane. She prided herself on protecting property values, though most residents quietly admitted it felt more like living under surveillance than stewardship. Every lawn blade out of place, every slightly faded mailbox, every improperly parked vehicle earned a warning letter, often with a fine attached. When the Johnson family moved into the community, they quickly learned how hostile Willow Creek could be. They were one of the few black families in the neighborhood, and although most residents gave polite waves, Marjorie's cold stares made it clear that they were being scrutinized. It started with small things: a note about their trash cans being placed out too early, then a citation for having overgrown grass, even though their yard was immaculate. Each warning carried a tone of something more than simple concern for neighborhood rules. The real conflict began when 12-year-old Marcus Johnson, a bright, athletic boy with an easy smile, began playing basketball in his driveway. The sound of the bouncing ball irritated Marjorie. She claimed it disturbed the peace and drove down property values. She sent multiple letters demanding the hoop be removed, even though several other families had similar setups. When the Johnsons ignored her unreasonable demands, she escalated. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Marcus rode his bike around the cul-de-sac, laughing with his friends. As he sped past Marjorie's perfectly trimmed hedges, the HOA president snapped. Witnesses later said she stormed out of her front door like a general marching to war, shouting about rules and standards. In a shocking act of aggression, she shoved Marcus off his bike, causing him to skid across the pavement. His knees bloodied and his palms torn open. The neighborhood froze in horror. Children ran inside. Parents rushed to help. But Marjorie didn't back down. She pointed at Marcus as though he were the criminal. The Johnsons were furious, but Marjorie assumed she could bully them into silence the way she had bullied everyone else. She sent an email to the HOA board justifying her actions, claiming Marcus had been recklessly endangering property. She didn't know that Marcus wasn't just any child. His father, Samuel Johnson, was no ordinary suburban dad. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Samuel was not the kind of man to let someone lay a hand on his son without consequences. As evening fell, the Johnson home glowed with the quiet tension of a family preparing to fight back. Neighbors whispered behind drawn blinds, wondering how Marjorie would spin her latest power trip. Some feared retaliation from her, while others silently hoped someone would finally put an end to her reign. The community had long been divided, but no one had anticipated this. An HOA president physically attacking a child. What Marjorie failed to realize was that this incident was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. It had escalated into something far larger, something far more dangerous for her. As Marcus sat on the couch with his scraped knees bandaged, his father made phone calls, not to lawyers, not to HOA committees, but to people whose authority reached far beyond suburban politics. By the time Marjorie poured herself a glass of wine that evening, smugly convinced she had taught that boy a lesson, a storm was already forming. And unlike her HOA power plays, this was a storm she couldn't control. The next morning would bring headlines, flashing lights, and federal agents to Willow Creek Estates. The morning after the confrontation was eerily calm in Willow Creek Estates, but that calm carried a weight, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Neighbors watered their lawns while stealing glances toward the Johnson residence, curious to see if anything would come of the previous day's violence. Marjorie Kane, confident as ever, walked her usual route around the cul-de-sac, inspecting driveways for any perceived infractions, her clipboard tucked under one arm as if it were a badge of honor. She believed her actions against Marcus were justified and that any fallout would fade once she exerted her influence over the HOA board. But not everyone shared her certainty. News of her assault on Marcus spread quickly through whispered conversations and late-night phone calls. Families who had endured years of her petty fines and intimidation felt a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Finally, Marjorie had crossed a line she could not simply paper over with HOA bylaws. Inside the Johnson home, Samuel Johnson was already moving with the precision of a man who had navigated far graver crises than an angry neighborhood official. His role as FBI director had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but seeing his own son hurt was an entirely different kind of battle. Marcus's scraped knees and trembling hands told a story no parent should have to hear. Samuel viewed the situation not as a neighborhood dispute but as an assault against his family, a personal violation that demanded immediate response. Before the sun had fully risen, calls were made. Not to lawyers, but to trusted colleagues who specialized in federal misconduct investigations. Within hours, Samuel had mobilized a quiet inquiry. What was meant to be a sleepy Saturday in a pristine subdivision quickly turned into a high-stakes operation. By late morning, unmarked black SUVs began appearing at the edges of Willow Creek. Federal agents, dressed inconspicuously, walked the sidewalks, posing as surveyors or repairmen. They quietly gathered witness statements, documented Marcus's injuries, and collected any security camera footage from nearby homes. Marjorie was too busy drafting yet another email to the HOA board to notice the silent net tightening around her. In her message, she painted Marcus as a reckless nuisance and herself as a guardian of order. She believed the HOA would rally to her defense, as they always had. But this time was different. When neighbors were approached by polite men and women flashing federal identification, the fear of HOA retaliation melted away. Long frustrated homeowners began to speak openly about Marjorie's history of harassment, her selective enforcement of rules, her threats of fines, and her obsession with maintaining control. For years, they had quietly resented her, but now they had an audience willing to listen and a shield against her power. While the investigation deepened, the first signs of trouble for Marjorie appeared at the local level. News outlets caught wind of the incident, thanks to a strategically placed tip. By afternoon, reporters were parked outside the neighborhood entrance, their cameras pointed at the gates, eager to capture the face of the HOA president who had allegedly assaulted a child. A single headline began circulating on social media: HOA president accused of attacking 12-year-old boy in Willow Creek. The article didn't yet mention Marcus's father or his position, but it didn't need to. Public outrage was already brewing. Marjorie, however, remained oblivious to the scale of what she had set in motion. She dismissed the reporters as sensationalists and assured the HOA board in yet another email that the matter was being handled. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that this wasn't just a neighborhood story anymore. It was escalating into a national scandal waiting to explode. By nightfall, the Johnson home was under discreet but heavy protection. Samuel wasn't taking chances. Plainclothes agents monitored the cul-de-sac, watching for any sign of retaliation. Inside, Marcus tried to focus on his schoolwork, unaware that his father's phone calls had triggered a chain reaction reaching the highest levels of government oversight. The following morning brought a new twist. The media dug deeper, uncovering Samuel Johnson's identity. The headline changed from a simple neighborhood assault to something far more explosive. FBI director's son assaulted by HOA president in Willow Creek Estates. The story spread like wildfire across television networks and online platforms. Suddenly, what had been Marjorie's private power struggle became a national talking point about abuse of authority, racial bias, and suburban overreach. As reporters crowded the front gates and satellite trucks lined the road, Marjorie finally began to realize she had miscalculated. Yet even then, She believed she could talk her way out of trouble. She began drafting statements to clarify her side of the story, convinced that charm and a little legal maneuvering could salvage her reputation. What she didn't know was that federal investigators had already built a case against her, not just for the assault, but for potential civil rights violations tied to her discriminatory HOA enforcement. By the time she stepped out of her house to confront the swarm of cameras, the neighborhood had already turned against her. Her neighbors watched from behind curtains, some recording videos of their own as Marjorie tried to defend herself. But her words rang hollow, her excuses weak against the undeniable image of a wounded child and the mounting evidence of her hostility. The stage was set. What Marjorie believed was a simple neighborhood conflict had become a full-blown federal investigation, and the woman who once ruled Willow Creek Estates with an iron fist was now the subject of relentless national scrutiny. The next chapter in this unfolding drama would not be written by HOA bylaws, but by federal law, and Marjorie Kane was about to learn what true power looked like. Willow Creek Estates woke to chaos. Satellite vans crowded the manicured entrance. Reporters leaned over wrought iron gates with cameras, and drones buzzed over rooftops, capturing images of a community suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. For years, Marjorie Kane had managed to keep her tight grip on the neighborhood, silencing complaints and intimidating residents. But now, her name was trending across the country, and her carefully cultivated reputation as a protector of property values had morphed into a symbol of suburban abuse and unchecked arrogance. Inside her pristine home, Marjorie scrambled to maintain control. She had spent the previous night sending frantic messages to the HOA board, demanding their public support. But even her loyal allies, those who had once nodded obediently to every citation she issued, were starting to distance themselves. They had no desire to be dragged into a scandal involving an assault on a child, especially not when that child's father was the director of the FBI. Meanwhile, federal investigators had shifted from quietly gathering evidence to full-scale action. What began as a small inquiry had ballooned into a sweeping investigation into Marjorie's history as HOA president. Complaints long buried out of fear began to surface. Residents spoke of discriminatory practices, selective enforcement of rules, and threats that had kept them silent. Families revealed letters filled with veiled intimidation, fines for infractions that others never received, and even whispered attempts to push certain neighbors out of the community entirely. The case against Marjorie was no longer just about the assault on Marcus Johnson. It was becoming a probe into abuse of power and potential civil rights violations within Willow Creek Estates itself. Samuel Johnson's influence ensured that every detail was scrutinized, every allegation recorded. Marjorie, blinded by her own ego, still believed she could manage the fallout. She scheduled interviews, prepared statements, and practiced her concerned but misunderstood persona. She told herself that this was all a misunderstanding, a smear campaign fueled by people jealous of her leadership. But her performance fell flat when confronted by the sheer weight of evidence. The cameras that captured her manicured smile also captured the glares of neighbors standing in the background, silently condemning her. As the days unfolded, federal subpoenas were issued. HOA financial records were seized. Every fine Marjorie had ever imposed was examined for patterns of bias. Even her personal bank records drew scrutiny when investigators discovered questionable transfers from HOA funds for administrative expenses that seemed more like personal luxuries. The walls of her suburban fortress were crumbling from every direction. The community, once cowed into obedience, began to revolt. Residents who had long stayed silent started sharing their own stories with reporters. A family recounted how Marjorie tried to block their backyard renovation because their children made too much noise. Another described how she threatened to have their car towed for lowering property values, even though it was legally parked in their own driveway. What had been whispered resentments were now public testimonies. Samuel Johnson, though quiet in the press, was relentless behind the scenes. His contacts ensured the investigation moved swiftly. Agents returned to the neighborhood day after day, gathering more accounts, and their presence reminded everyone that this was no longer a petty neighborhood dispute. On the third day of the media firestorm, a dramatic scene unfolded. Federal vehicles rolled up to Marjorie's house as cameras swiveled to capture every second. Agents emerged with files and equipment, executing a warrant to seize documents and electronics. Marjorie stood in her doorway, visibly shaken for the first time. Her confident smile faltered as neighbors recorded from across the street, some openly relieved to see her finally facing consequences. What Marjorie didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The FBI investigation had uncovered more than just neighborhood bullying. There were whispers of illegal favoritism in HOA contracts, allegations of kickbacks from local maintenance companies, and patterns of racial bias in enforcement decisions. Her reign of control, once propped up by intimidation and fear, was unraveling under the bright light of federal scrutiny. For Marcus Johnson, the boy at the center of it all, the ordeal was surreal. He watched from his window as the woman who had shoved him to the pavement, the same woman who had written countless threatening letters to his family, was now being treated not as a queen of the cul-de-sac but as a subject of a federal probe. His father shielded him from the worst of the media attention, but Marcus could sense the shift. The neighborhood no longer whispered about the Johnsons as outsiders. Instead, they whispered about justice, accountability, and the long-overdue fall of Marjorie Kane. By the end of the week, Marjorie's allies on the HOA board had resigned in quick succession, unwilling to face legal consequences themselves. Without their support, she stood completely alone. Her attempts to downplay the incident, to frame herself as the victim, collapsed under the weight of irrefutable evidence and the powerful name backing the child she attacked. But the most devastating blow came when investigators hinted at federal charges, not only for the assault on Marcus, but for broader misconduct tied to her position. Marjorie began to understand that this was no longer just about losing her HOA presidency. She was staring down the possibility of losing her freedom. As night fell on Willow Creek Estates, the once proud president of the HOA sat in her living room, blinds drawn against the flashing news cameras outside. She had built her identity on control, but now control was slipping from her grasp. And the next move would not be hers to make. The storm was about to break wide open, and Marjorie Kane was about to face consequences far greater than she ever imagined. By the fourth day of relentless media coverage, Willow Creek Estates no longer resembled the peaceful suburban enclave it once pretended to be. News vans parked along the main road, reporters stood at the entrance clamoring for interviews, and neighbors who had long kept quiet now openly spoke to anyone willing to listen. The illusion of perfection, the manicured lawns, the painted fences, the HOA rules that supposedly kept everything in order, had shattered. And at the center of it all stood Marjorie Kane, stripped of the authority she had wielded so ruthlessly. Inside her immaculate home, Marjorie tried to maintain the facade of control. She drafted statements, rehearsed talking points, and practiced the same polished smile she used at HOA meetings. But behind closed doors, fear seeped in. Her phone buzzed constantly, not with support, but with warnings. Attorneys advised her to stop speaking to the media. Former allies on the HOA board refused to answer her calls. And neighbors she once intimidated now walked past her home with defiant stares. The power she thought was unshakable had evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, the investigation moved swiftly. Federal agents poured through HOA financial records, uncovering a pattern of suspicious expenditures and irregular contracts. Payments to favored landscaping companies raised questions about kickbacks. Selective enforcement of fines revealed a troubling trend of targeting certain families who, in many cases, shared Marcus Johnson's skin color. What had started as a single incident of physical assault was rapidly evolving into a broader case of civil rights violations and abuse of authority. For Samuel Johnson, this was no longer just about defending his son. It had become a matter of principle. He was determined to expose every ounce of corruption buried under Willow Creek's manicured lawns. His quiet but relentless efforts ensured that every witness felt safe to speak. Neighbors who once feared Marjorie's retaliation now lined up to share their stories with investigators. Tales of bullying, harassment, and intimidation poured out. Families fined for minor infractions while others received special treatment. Homeowners threatened with liens for questioning board decisions, and a chilling pattern of letters sent only to certain residents. The community itself began to change. Without Marjorie's grip on the HOA board, homeowners gathered informally to discuss removing her from power. They shared copies of letters she had sent, compared outrageous fines, and spoke openly about the years of tension. The very people she had controlled through fear were now uniting against her. Even those who had once supported her strict enforcement of rules now saw the truth. Her leadership was not about protecting property values, but about feeding her own ego and prejudice. As pressure mounted, Marjorie tried to pivot. She released a carefully worded public statement claiming that her actions had been misinterpreted and that she was deeply concerned for the well-being of all children in the community. But the damage was done. Photos of Marcus's injuries had gone viral, and footage of federal agents removing boxes of records from her home painted a picture she couldn't erase. Her attempts to portray herself as the victim only deepened public outrage. Then came the most devastating development yet. Investigators discovered that Marjorie had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, luxury furniture, spa treatments, and even a lavish vacation labeled as a board retreat. What had once been whispers among neighbors was now hard evidence of embezzlement. Combined with the civil rights complaints and the assault on Marcus, her legal troubles reached a point of no return. The media narrative shifted from a simple assault case to a full-blown scandal. HOA president accused of discrimination, embezzlement, and assault, facing federal charges. National commentators debated how someone with so little real authority could wield so much power over her neighbors. Experts spoke about systemic abuse in homeowners associations, using Willow Creek Estates as a prime example. In the midst of it all, Marcus remained shielded from the worst of the storm. Samuel made sure his son stayed out of the spotlight, focusing on school and friends while the adults handled the fallout. But even Marcus could sense the change in the air. The whispers and suspicious looks his family once endured had turned into nods of support and quiet words of encouragement from neighbors. What had begun as an act of hatred was transforming into a moment of reckoning for the entire community. By the end of the week, Marjorie's once pristine image was in ruins. Her attorney advised her to step down as HOA president, but she stubbornly refused, clinging to the last remnants of her authority. She believed she could fight this, that her connections and charm would save her. But Samuel Johnson's connections reached farther than hers ever could, and his resolve was unshakable. Late that night, while the neighborhood slept under the watch of federal patrol cars, a quiet decision was made. Prosecutors prepared to file charges not only for assault but for fraud and civil rights violations. The investigation had gathered enough evidence to make an example out of Marjorie Kane. The next morning would not bring another round of frantic emails or smug HOA inspections. It would bring something far more serious, a confrontation with justice that Marjorie could no longer avoid. The woman who had ruled Willow Creek Estates through fear was about to be stripped of her power in the most public way possible. The morning sun rose over Willow Creek Estates, casting long shadows across driveways lined with luxury cars and flower beds trimmed to perfection. But the neighborhood's outward calm was deceptive. Everyone knew that today would be different. The federal investigation had reached its tipping point, and the once feared HOA president, Marjorie Kane, was about to face the full weight of justice. For days, black SUVs had quietly patrolled the cul-de-sacs, their tinted windows reflecting Marjorie's growing panic. Agents had already combed through her home office, seizing records and devices, and her bank statements told a story of greed and entitlement. The evidence of misused HOA funds, discriminatory fines, and the physical assault on Marcus Johnson painted a picture of a woman who believed herself untouchable. But today, the illusion of power would shatter. Neighbors woke early, drawn to their windows by the hum of engines. At first, it seemed like just another day of media chaos. Reporters gathering at the gate, drones hovering overhead, cameras pointed at Marjorie's two-story home. But then something different happened. A convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled directly into the neighborhood, stopping at her driveway. The doors opened, and federal agents stepped out, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to the frenzied energy of the press. Inside, Marjorie stood frozen. She had rehearsed explanations, excuses, even tears if necessary. She still clung to the belief that she could talk her way out of trouble, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But when the knock came at her door, it wasn't the polite tap of an HOA complaint. It was the firm, undeniable sound of authority. The agents entered with a warrant, their presence commanding and unyielding. They moved through her home with precision, collecting the last of the documents and electronic devices needed for prosecution. Outside, neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering and recording the scene on their phones. For years, Marjorie had walked these streets like a queen surveying her kingdom, issuing fines and threats at will. Now she stood in her doorway, pale and trembling, her clipboard nowhere in sight. The arrest was swift. The agents read the charges: assault on a minor, civil rights violations, and embezzlement of HOA funds. The cameras captured every second as Marjorie was escorted to an unmarked car. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her carefully curated image in ruins. For the first time, the woman who had ruled Willow Creek through intimidation looked small, powerless, and afraid. The neighborhood reacted with a mix of shock and relief. Some residents cheered quietly from their doorsteps, while others simply watched in silence, unable to believe that the woman who had fined them for mailbox paint colors was now facing federal charges. The HOA board, already gutted by resignations, issued a hasty statement distancing themselves from her, condemning her actions and promising to hold new elections. Samuel Johnson watched the scene unfold from inside his home. His son, Marcus, sat beside him, still recovering from the emotional weight of the past week. Samuel felt no triumph, only a cold sense of justice. This was never about revenge, it was about accountability. No one, regardless of their position or influence, had the right to harm a child or abuse authority. As Marjorie's car disappeared down the street, federal investigators remained behind to finish their work. They spoke with neighbors, gathering additional testimony to ensure that every wrong she had committed would be brought to light. Homeowners shared years of pent-up frustration, detailing how she had used HOA rules to punish families she disliked and reward those who fell in line. The investigation was no longer just about Marjorie. It was about dismantling a culture of unchecked power that had allowed her behavior to thrive. News outlets broadcast the arrest live, and within hours, headlines appeared nationwide. HOA president arrested for assaulting FBI director's son. The story dominated social media feeds, sparking debates about homeowners associations, racial discrimination, and abuse of authority. Commentators pointed to Willow Creek Estates as an example of how petty power, left unchecked, could spiral into something far more sinister. As the day wore on, the neighborhood began to feel different. The oppressive weight of Marjorie's control had lifted. Children rode their bikes freely without fear of reprimand, and families spoke openly with each other about the need for change. The community that once lived in quiet resentment now united in determination to rebuild trust. Marjorie spent the night in federal custody, facing a reality she had never imagined. The woman who once dictated the height of hedges and the placement of trash cans was now facing years in prison. Her arrogance had blinded her to the fact that power was never truly hers to wield, at least not without consequence. Back in Willow Creek, the Johnson family finally found peace. Marcus's wounds were healing, both physical and emotional, and the neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered words of support. Samuel remained vigilant, knowing that justice was a process, not a single moment. But for the first time in days, the neighborhood felt safe again. Yet, even as Marjorie awaited her arraignment, questions lingered. How had she been allowed to wield so much unchecked power for so long? How many other communities were ruled by similar figures, hiding behind HOA bylaws to mask personal prejudice and greed? The answers would come in time, but one thing was certain: Willow Creek Estates would never be the same. The arrest of its once untouchable president was more than just a personal reckoning. It was a warning to every petty tyrant who believed they could operate without oversight. And as the sun set on that transformative day, the community braced for what came next. The trial that would expose every secret Marjorie Kane had fought so hard to keep buried. The storm that followed was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. What started as quiet whispers of discontent had grown into a roar that no one, especially the HOA president, could silence. After federal agents swept through the community with precise efficiency, the once feared leader of the HOA stood stripped of his power, his carefully constructed world collapsing in on itself. News vans lined the streets, cameras pointed at the gates of the pristine subdivision, capturing every moment of his downfall. The headlines told the story in bold letters: HOA president under federal investigation after attack on FBI director's son. The community that once trembled under his authority now stared in stunned disbelief. Homeowners who had previously stayed silent out of fear now spoke freely, recounting years of intimidation, unfair fines, and selective enforcement of rules. The FBI's investigation revealed a long trail of misconduct. The assault on the young boy was only the spark. Underneath lay years of corruption, misused HOA funds, retaliatory penalties, even harassment of families who resisted his demands. What had been dismissed as neighborhood politics now carried the weight of federal crimes. As word spread that the child's father was not just any parent but the FBI director himself, the public outcry intensified. People who had ignored HOA scandals before now paid attention. Social media exploded with anger, questioning how someone in such a small position of power had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. The narrative shifted quickly from a neighborhood dispute to a cautionary tale about abuse of authority in plain sight. Inside the neighborhood, residents saw the balance of power flip overnight. The HOA president's allies, those who had benefited from his favoritism or feared losing their own privileges, began distancing themselves. Some resigned from the board outright, hoping to escape the looming legal fallout. Others tried to play both sides, pretending they had never supported his heavy-handed tactics. Meanwhile, the boy and his family remained away from the spotlight, shielded by federal protection. Their absence spoke louder than any words could. This was not just a local incident. This was personal for people who had the means to ensure justice. And justice was coming swiftly. As the investigation deepened, federal prosecutors filed charges not only for the physical attack but for conspiracy, financial fraud, and civil rights violations. The HOA president, once so confident and untouchable, now faced the very system he thought he controlled. Court documents painted a picture of a man consumed by arrogance, whose petty neighborhood feud had spiraled into a national scandal. The community's recovery was slow. Meetings were held without the looming shadow of intimidation, and for the first time, homeowners openly discussed dismantling the entire HOA or at least rebuilding it from the ground up. The fear that had once kept everyone quiet dissolved into determination. People realized they had tolerated abuse for too long simply because they thought they had no choice. As sentencing day approached, reporters swarmed the courthouse, eager to capture the final chapter of this bizarre saga. The HOA president's polished image, once immaculate, always smiling for photo opportunities, was gone. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weariness on his face as federal marshals led him into the courtroom. The man who had prided himself on knowing every rule and bending it to his advantage now stood powerless. His fate decided by forces far greater than any HOA board meeting. The verdict was decisive. Guilty on all counts. The judge's words were stern, condemning not only the physical assault on an innocent child, but also the years of intimidation and corruption. The sentence was lengthy, ensuring he would spend years reflecting on his actions from behind bars. For the neighborhood, the ruling brought both relief and reckoning. Some felt shame for having stayed silent. Others felt vindicated for the years they'd spent pushing back against unjust treatment. The FBI director never made a public statement about his son, but the message was clear. No one, no matter how small their jurisdiction, was above the law. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. The board was restructured with honest, accountable members, and policies were reviewed to prevent abuse of power in the future. The boy returned to his home, welcomed by neighbors who now treated his family with the respect they had always deserved. The air of fear was gone, replaced by something new: awareness. What had begun as a cruel act of harassment ended in federal court, with a clear warning to anyone who thought authority was a tool for personal gain. The HOA president had believed his position made him untouchable. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. And in the end, his arrogance had destroyed him. This wasn't just the fall of a neighborhood tyrant. It was a reminder to everyone watching that power, when misused, will always meet its reckoning. Sometimes that reckoning comes from within the community. And sometimes, when the wrong person is hurt, it comes from the very top of the federal government. The neighborhood never forgot the lesson. And they never forgot how quickly fear can turn to justice when the right people step in.